our department is made up of radically different subject backgrounds. So I'm a political historian by background. Scott's a geneticist, we have mathematicians, we have English language people, we have English literature folks, we have psychologists, we have educational investigators. We are the broadest range of subjects that you can possibly imagine, and we're all forced, and forced is the right word, we're all forced to work together in a glass bubble. So one of the things and one of the reasons why years ago Scott and I became so passionate about things like Talk About X is that we had to figure out ways of explaining our research and our concepts and our ideas to each other in a way that made sense and in a way that showed off the importance of the things that we each have done. So what we're going to do over the next couple of minutes is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my research, and then Scott's going to talk a little bit about some of his research, just as a way of again showing the types of things that we have done in our research and some of the ways in which we are then trying to show that. And as Scott says, it's about thinking about the ways in which, not just Scott and me, but the ways in which all of the presenters today take what is actually oftentimes either really boring, laborious, time-consuming, or really difficult research processes and put that into something that looks, hopefully, at least a little bit exciting. So, as I said, I'm a political historian. I'm really interested in the way in which British politicians have shaped ideas and shaped concepts, and the way in which Parliament both reflects those concepts and those ideas, and the way in which Parliament then shapes the discussion that happens. Right? So I'm really interested essentially in the ways in which these people, whether we like them or not, phrase ideas, talk about concepts, and discuss different meanings in Parliament. Okay, and I use Parliament as the basis for my research. So what I'm interested in then is looking at throughout from 1803 roughly to the modern times-ish, how the people in this building have spoken, what they've said, and what they've discussed. Okay, and the way in which I do that is by looking at the records of all parliamentary speeches and all parliamentary debates. So every speech in Parliament is recorded, including all of Boris Johnson's, which is an impressive task. Every speech in Parliament is recorded, both on audio, but then also published for the next day. So what you have here is the person sitting, so I don't know if you know the House of Commons, but there's the Speaker who sits in the chair in the middle, and then up above him there's a very old clock, and then up above him are these folks here, and they're writing out by hand, because typing would make too much noise, they're writing out by hand notes on what any politician is saying at that point. They work in 5-minute shifts, they go down to the chamber, write for 5 minutes, go back up and type up what they've done. So you can get access to a debate that happened yesterday, today, and they're published in works like this. Okay, and that's called Hansard, and it's been available in print since 1803. This is almost strictly verbatim, but not quite verbatim, but almost strictly verbatim account of what was said in Parliament each day. And you can see here that they check to make sure that they're understanding the right things. So this is a message from one of the Hansard reporters to a Scottish MP, and it says, "What did you say about the SNP? It sounded like big fairies." And the MP replied saying, no, it's big fearties, which is a Scottish reference to people who are frightened. Right? So they check and get things to make sense in context. So where I come in then is, at Glasgow we built a Hansard corpus. So this is a collection of all of these speeches. There are 202 years worth of speeches in this corpus, and that's 1.6 billion words worth of speech, which if you were reading inside your head, which we can read inside our head faster than we can talk, it would take you 55 years to read through silently, which is about 7.5 million speeches by 40,000 individual speakers. Right? So this is a humongous collection of data, a humongous collection of information. What we also have at Glasgow is the world's only historical thesaurus. So the historical thesaurus of English. And what happened here was, in the 1960s, academics here at Glasgow decided to try and take the fact that in a dictionary, all word meanings are locked in alphabetical format. So we can't see how many words we have for particular concepts, we can't see how many words we have for particular ideas, we can't see how many words we have to describe a thing. So what those academics did between 1965 and 2012 was physically rip out every single page of the dictionary and go through and catalogue each one of these words depending on what they meant and when they were used. Okay, so this was about a 40-year task of going through every page of the dictionary. What that allows us to then have is groupings of words based on meaning, concepts, or ideas. So we can see, and English is the only language that we can do this for, we can see throughout time the concepts and ideas that we have had for, or the words that we have had for particular concepts or for particular ideas. Okay, so I've taken the example here of uncivilized. This is all of the words that we as speakers of English have had to talk about people, things, practices, places that we think to be uncivilized. Okay, so it goes from the oldest up at the top, which is in Old English, through down to the most modern, down here, which is like medieval and jungly and so on. Okay, so they are the 42 words that we have had throughout our history to talk about what we thought to be uncivilized. So what we can then do is apply this to Hansard, and then we can look at how politicians have spoken about ideas and concepts. Right? The only way to do this before was to individually word search, so think of all the words you could think of for a concept and then search them. With the thesaurus, we can then take that out and look at all the possible variations of word use in Parliament to get a map of what were politicians talking about with regards to this idea. Okay, so if we're talking about uncivilized, that's how this kind of looks in the data format. What we see from that then is that between 1803 and 2003, we have 2,044 references in Hansard to things being uncivilized, barbaric, savage, so on. Okay. What we can then do from that, though, is look at that in much more depth and much more detail. So there are patterns that emerge here from those 1.6 billion words taken down to 2044. We can then see the patterns that emerge in how politicians have used these concepts. So if we look at the use of describing a concept or a place or a thing or a practice as uncivilized, whether we're talking about it happening now or in the past, you can see that the past is blue, present is green, that there is a shift away from talking about things happening in the past being uncivilized to practices or people or places or things in the present being uncivilized. Okay, so politicians, instead of saying, say in 1800 here, instead of saying this thing that was happening before is uncivilized, by 2000, we're much more saying this thing happening right now. This is a barbaric or a savage practice or place or people. Okay. We can also see that we shift from the animate to the inanimate. So animate are things like people or countries, and we shift away from talking about people or countries as being uncivilized. Okay, so there's, in the 1840s, it's almost half and half, where we're talking about people or countries being uncivilized. By 2000, we almost don't talk about people being uncivilized at all. So we're talking more there about practices or policies. And then the last example I'll show you here just quickly is on referring to countries. Right, so we've got the UK is in blue, foreign countries, international countries are in green, and then Ireland is across the top, because I'll talk about that in a second, a very specific reason for that. So what we can see here is two different things. Firstly, that there is a shift from talking about foreign people or foreign countries as being uncivilized towards talking about us, ourselves, our own practices, our own policies as being uncivilized in Parliament. Okay? And part of that is through the process of building and then losing the empire, the process of decolonization, that we have, Britain went out into the world and had contact with a huge number of people across the globe, and then has lost that over time. The other thing to point out here is Parliament's obsession with Ireland, and this shows us some of the relationships that the British Parliament has had with Ireland. So Ireland joined the Union, and we became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801. We then had the Irish Civil Wars through the 1920s, and then in the 1980s we had the Troubles with Northern Ireland. So Ireland and Northern Ireland separated off, and Northern Ireland stayed part of the UK. So if we look at, for example, 1880, at this point, Britain controls about a quarter of the entire globe. So the British Empire makes up about a quarter of the entire globe. Ireland is one small part of that, but you have here this huge chunk of discussion of Ireland at the top. So we can see from the data here the obsession of British politicians and parliamentarians with Ireland. Okay. If we look at that in actual numbers, we can see 877 instances where we can recognize a particular country as being classified as uncivilized. So Ireland and Northern Ireland are at the top. India is next, again through that process of empire building, and then empire lost, so India gained independence in 1948. That's the focus of Parliament there. Russia, unsurprisingly, is probably the Cold War, so discussion of the Russian practices through the Cold War, and then Scotland is just inherently barbaric as a place, so we're up there at the top. Iraq, further down, will be the two Iraq wars, and Europe just underneath that. So this data goes at the moment up to 2003. If we took it up to 2020, I would imagine that Europe would have jumped, considering the discussion that we've had over the last endless number of years around about Brexit. So I would imagine that will jump. Okay. So what we have then is big data in the humanities. 1.6 billion words, 7.5 million speeches. What this looks like in practice is me sitting in the British Library handwriting out speeches. So that I have spent countless days handwriting out, and I have a bump on my finger here from having done that for so long, counting out countless speeches. That's not the most practical or fast way of doing this, so we use these new computing technologies, that big data approaches, to try and analyze those pieces of text, to try and analyze those ideas and those concepts. So what we can see from that then is that in Parliament there's a shift from discussion of foreign people or places to the domestic practices. There's a shift from specific places to practice in Parliament, and there's a shift from animate to inanimate. Okay, thanks.
The number of people on the planet is going up at a rate that it's never gone up before. And what that means is that we have a competition between the space on the planet that we need for people to carry out their lives and the amount of space that we have on the planet to supply those people, you and me, with things that they need to carry on being alive. One of those problems is, I'm not going to talk about global warming in the sense of having things that are too hot right now, but a connected problem with that is a problem of salination. So salination means the increase of the amount of saltiness in the soil. And another way that this comes around is from deforestation, which is obviously happening on a large scale across the planet. So this is a diagram of what might normally happen in a forested area. Right? So at the top you have the trees, they've got their long roots reaching down into the soil, and below the trees you've got that blue water table. Right? That's where the natural level of water is. There are minerals in those rocks, but the trees keep that top layer fairly dry because they're drawing water up all the time, because they need the water to live. When deforestation happens, suddenly that pump that's bringing up the water stops, and what that means is that part can become saturated, that was previously dry, and that happens when the water table comes up and brings with it those minerals, some of which are salt. And then at the end of this process, it becomes a bit of a perpetuating cycle where the salty soil kills off more plants, which means then you have less drainage of the soil, which means you have more percolation up with salt, and it leads to a huge problem. And this is all fine in a cartoon, but what that means for someone who's maybe growing farm crops is this. So if we have more people to feed, we need to feed them, and we're losing land that we can grow the food on, then that presents a challenge. And this is a challenge for farmers primarily across the middle of the world, and that's important because across the middle of the world is where it's nice and warm, right? And that's where you can grow all of the wheat and the rice and the barley and everything that supplies huge numbers of calories for the world. It's also a huge problem for Australia, which is basically all one of the problematic colours. So the question then is, how can we solve the problem of salt toxicity for crops? So I'd like you to think about what it's like to be a plant. Right? Imagine you are a stalk of corn in the soil. As a human being, when something challenging comes along, you're used to being able to run away. Right? Fight or flight is the response that we talk about. Plants don't have the option to do flight. They have to stand there and fight somehow. So you can't leave. The next thing that might occur to you is somehow to get rid of this salt, take it away from you. But of course, plants don't have the power to do that. So they have to somehow deal with it. And when we're talking about ways that plants might deal with it, essentially that means we're looking at the genetic mechanisms that they have. You'd be amazed, or I was amazed, the number of times when I told people about my research and I got that question. Plants have got DNA? Yes, so if that's news to you, then hopefully this next part will help tide over that gap to explain the necessary bits before my research. This is Arabidopsis thaliana. It's a weed, it's not a crop, but it's much easier to use than growing white wheat and barley in the lab because it's tiny. It's only a few inches small, and rather than taking a whole season to grow, you can get plant seeds and get more seeds back out of that plant that grows up 6 weeks later. You can also get thousands of seeds from every plant, which is helpful if you're trying to look at variation of plants. You can put thousands of them out on soil and see what's happening. And it's also handy as a geneticist because we know what all the genes are. We just don't know what they do. So my job was to go in and look for a gene in there that might help solve the problem of salt tolerance in crops. So it's used as a model. It's not a crop, but we're using it in place because it's much easier for all the reasons I've just mentioned. So step one in my research was to cause random changes to the DNA of thousands of these seeds. So on average, each of the seeds got maybe one change in its DNA somewhere. We didn't know what that change was. And then we planted those seeds in an environment where they shouldn't be able to grow. Right? It's salty enough in this case that normal seeds would just not germinate and give us plants. And then that meant that if any did grow, it was presumably because we had done something to that plant to make it more tolerant. And then we could say, well, what's going on here? So that's exactly what happened. If you think about scientific research on the news, you might think of people in lab coats and walking around with Petri dishes, moving them around the lab where you can see bacteria. You can grow plants on those as well. So that's what we did. That's not me, that's one of my colleagues with their arms in the sterile cabinet. And on the right is an example of what our experimental outcome was. You've got lots and lots of seeds there that have maybe just started to grow, but basically given up shortly afterwards, except for the odd one that looked like this. So it's only very young, so it's only got 2 tiny leaves coming out of it. But that was a sign that maybe we've got a successful plant there with some interesting genetic changes. And so when it comes to saying what does a gene do, there are loads of potential options. You have genes for all sorts of different things, but you have also the concept that some genes do jobs and some genes tell other genes to do their job and when to do it and how to do it. So I was searching around for an analogy and I thought, where else do we have a situation like that? Well, we're in one right now. So across the hall there in the principal's office suites is Professor Sir Anton Muscatelli. He tells everybody else what to do. And below him, we have Moira, who has just had to go off because she's so busy telling other people what to do that she couldn't stay here for very long. She's a vice principal, as you heard, learning and teaching. There's also a vice principal for research who's not here today, and I think 8, 9, 10 other vice principals who basically run the university. And then below Moira, there are 4 deans of learning and teaching with each college. We have Professor Wendy Anderson, who's the Dean for the College of Arts in the front row here. And they tell other people what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And so what's really interesting as a scientist is if you can get like the principal or if you can get the vice principal. I didn't quite get that high. No offense, I maybe got Wendy. And that's really, really interesting because it meant I wasn't just finding one gene that did one tiny job. I had a gene that did lots of jobs or told other genes to do their jobs. And so we found a plant that was important in salt tolerance. We thought, is it also important in tolerating other stresses? So we put the seeds on a Petri dish again. And on the right-hand side, that's what you see there, the roots all growing down. On the left is a fungus. And what's astonishing is that line there is just a felt tip marker on the lid on this pen, and the fungus wasn't able to go and contaminate the plants. It was a Gandalf situation. So we were really excited in the lab. We've got a gene that helps salt tolerance, it helps pathogen tolerance, and it probably also is important in lots of other tolerance as well. So although my PhD came to an end and I couldn't carry on working on this forever, I think the message that you can take away from this is that when we're looking for ways to try and improve the biological situation around us, whether it's plants or whatever else, maybe the approach we could take is rather than trying to put something in, let what's in there in nature tell us what its job is, which is kind of what we did by just making a change, a very slight change. And then that gives us ways, gives us hooks, gives us tools that we can take advantage of that we can then just maybe turn up to 110%. And that makes the crop able to grow in places that are too hot, too dry, too salty. And so while my research, Andrew told you about his research, was sitting in the British Library copying out the speeches by hand, mine was moving tiny volumes of colourless liquid from one tube to another for endless hours of my life in a lab coat. But really, and this is the point that everybody can share in here, we all make our small contributions to research in some small, tiny way, but it's all part of a larger conversation. And for me, if we can all work together in labs to go towards that same goal, that goal is bringing us one step closer to being able to feed the world. Pause for effect. So that's everything that I wanted to say about my research. Andrew's going to come back up and join me on the stage here.
The reason behind us thinking about this is, as I said at the start, we are super keen on trying to impress on folks the importance of being able to communicate their ideas as effectively as possible. As Moira said at the start, Scott and I came up with the idea behind Talk About X literally a fortnight before the very first one, and then had a very rushed fortnight to do it. The main takeaway over the last 6 years of doing this is there's two main takeaways actually, how fantastic the presentations and the posters are and how much work and effort goes into the creation of really genuinely outstanding presentations from the students, and then also the level and knowledge of the level and quality of knowledge and research that happens at undergraduate level here is astounding. And we have this conversation every single year in our department where we talk about the fact that the folks giving the presentations and giving the posters this year blow so many of us out of the water as people who do this for our job in the most uncomfortable way for us, which is fantastic for you guys, but the way in which you're capable of doing this is so astoundingly good, and we love it. The entire department loves this every single year, and I just wanted to kind of hammer home the positive message of how much this is so good, and we look forward to it so much. So that's the end of our kind of contribution for the day. With Scott, Maxine and I will be chairing, so we'll be the ones doing the questions, but otherwise it's the rest of the day is over to the student presenters.